Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got another video in our Top 10 series. Today the prompt is Top 10 War-Winning Weapons. So these are specifically weapons that primarily the United States used to win World War II. As I go through my list, you'll no doubt have disagreements with the order. I'm not entirely sold on the order I made. You can argue that in the comments and maybe I'll change my mind. And you may have disagreements on the 10 things I listed. Something you think should be on there is missing, or something I added not being as important as I think it is. I do tend to study the Pacific War more than the war in Europe, so things are weighted kind of heavily there. But let us know in the comments what you think your list would be. But when I was making this list, I thought of aircraft like my favorites, or land vehicles for that matter, like the Sherman tank, particularly the EZ-8 Sherman tank, or the F-6F Hellcat. And at the end of the day, none of those types of vehicles made it on this list. I just didn't think that the Sherman or the Hellcat was a particularly war-winning weapon, or that it distinguished itself from its peers. The U.S. military had a dozen different fighter planes that were all good to some capacity. There was no one Corsair or Mustang or whatever the case may be that was so far ahead of everything else that it won the war. It was this whole group, and I don't think, and there is a place in here where I have X group generically instead of X specific thing, but I don't think American fighter planes or American tanks or that sort of thing were particularly war-winning. Again, this is specifically American things. That's where I tend to focus more. America did not win World War II on their own, but that's my expertise. So my top 10 lists are American weapons that helped win the war, and primarily the war in the Pacific. But yeah, let me know what you would swap out that seems too Pacific related, and what you would swap in its place, and if there are any other allied weapon systems you would swap in. The Russian T-34 tank, I do think, would be on this list if I was talking about allies, even though the American tanks or whatnot wouldn't be. The British effort to break the Enigma code would probably be on here if I was doing all allies. But yeah, let me know in your list in the comment section down below. And if you want to focus on different nations in particular, and maybe we'll do something like this in the future. Now that the preamble's out of the way, my opinion for the number 10 war-winning weapon is the fleet train system that the U.S. Navy developed during World War II. Whereas most navies had to return to dock in port in their home country or one of their colonies when they had gone through a battle, the U.S. Navy was able to remain forward deployed throughout much of the war. This was largely because the U.S. developed a series of resupply ships that could resupply the ships underway, or in sheltered anchorages that were undeveloped in these forward island bases that they took, and particularly the floating dry docks that the U.S. Navy made that were able to dry dock any size vessel, essentially, out in the middle of the Pacific. So the fleet bases that we were able to develop at Ulithi and Eniwetok as we pushed through the Central Pacific was huge, that we didn't have to rotate the fleet home to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. And we were able to keep the bulk of the fleet forward deployed throughout basically the last two and a half years of the war. Our ability to continue to keep pressure on Japan and keep marching towards Japan consistently using the same fleet of ships, I think, is a war-winning system. It certainly expedited the end of the war. Instead of having to cycle them back, wait 6 months, then go out and launch the next offensive, we were able to consistently launch offensives. In the number 9 slot, I have Kaiser's whole mass production system. Basically, the Battle of the Atlantic, and therefore the war in Europe, was won by Kaiser's taking other companies like Ford's system of mass producing and applying that to a much larger vehicle. In Kaiser's system, particularly the Liberty ships, that were able to transport cargo across the Atlantic in numbers greater than could be sunk. Not only were we able to mass produce these merchant ships that were able to do this, we were also able to mass produce other types of warships, the destroyer escorts that then are able to hunt down the submarines, and the escort carriers, the aircraft that we used throughout the war. All of this was done through American mass production techniques, and America really was the arsenal of democracy during World War II. Not only were we able to supply our own armed forces, but we were able to supply significant percentages of other allied nations' military equipment needs. Liberty ships and the destroyer escorts that escorted them across the Atlantic through the later part of World War II basically turned the tide of that war. And Germany's very successful submarine blockade effort up until that point was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. In the number 8 position, I have the Higgins landing boat. Higgins boats and the other various types of landing craft that the U.S. developed during World War II, Higgins boats and the other types of landing craft that the U.S. developed during World War II and was able to mass produce was a huge war-winning weapon. We had to conduct amphibious operations in Africa, Europe, and across the Pacific. And prior to this point, amphibious operations were relatively rare and often used like generic standard boats. So the development of a mass producible vessel that you could land troops and equipment and heavy vehicles and all of that sort of stuff directly onto a contested beachhead, which is another thing that's new. You shouldn't say never, but the number of times in history that contested amphibious invasions occur is relatively light. Like sometimes there's skirmishers or light fire going on as you land stuff. But in terms of, say, a D-Day invasion or a Tarawa or an Iwo Jima, where you are landing an army under concentrated fire, just doesn't happen before World War II. So these equipment, these pieces of equipment and the tactics developed to use them are entirely war-winning. And it's relatively unique to World War II and the years immediately after it, because Korea, we use it a couple of times, but by Vietnam, we're primarily using air mobile assets. And that's more where we lean today. We don't really conduct amphibious operations when we can just take troops in by air. So this is a distinctly World War II era technology. In my number 7 spot, I have the fleet-type submarine. While Germany tried on 2 separate occasions to blockade Great Britain, the United States was able to blockade Japan. Japan, like Great Britain, is an island empire that relied on resources that they had to import from their colonies and possessions overseas. And the United States submarine fleet was able to interdict these resources and choke and strangle the Japanese war effort. The fleet-type submarines were able to be mass-produced in numbers. They had the size, range, and carrying capacity to take a war all the way across the Pacific Ocean and stay on patrol for a month or more at a time. So these types of vessels are really war-winning. The fleet-type submarines were primarily the Gato, Baleo, and Tench class. So I'd probably, if I had to choose a specific class, I'd probably say the Gatos. But you know, as a group, fleet-type submarines were only incremental improvements on each other, and as a group, they were a war-winning weapon. In my number 6 spot, I have the M1 Garand. This is the only infantry weapon that I have on the list, but I think that the M1 Garand was a significant enough development over other types of weapons. Most nations were still using bolt-action rifles for their common infantrymen, where the M1 Garand is semi-automatic. It had exceptional stopping power. It was relatively fast to reload. It was a pretty good weapon during World War II. And while other countries also developed semi-automatic infantry weapons, they were not as mass-produced and widely distributed as the M1 Garand. So the M1 Garand sees action on all fronts with U.S. and other allied armies throughout the war. And I think it is the best of the infantry rifles. Other weapons like submachine guns and bazookas and other sorts of infantry weapons were certainly important. But I don't know that an American bazooka is war-winning or unique enough from a Panzerschreck to say that it's special. The M1 Garand's sheer numbers and maybe only incremental advancement over other infantry weapons, I think is enough to make it a war-winning weapon system. Submachine guns are great, pretty much World War II innovation, but they had started before then, but they weren't used extensively until World War II. But they weren't a war-winning weapon, and they weren't. Every infantryman wasn't issued one of them. The Garand was issued to just about everyone. 5 slot, I have the U.S. Navy Seabees. The Seabees were not in existence prior to America's entry into World War II, and they were vitally important for the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. Instead of contesting fortified Japanese positions, we could take pretty much any flat piece of land on any old island and turn it into an airfield in very short order, thanks to the Seabees. The Seabees also supported the U.S. military in a number of other ways, but the most important was creating airfields on Pacific islands so that we could take lesser contested islands and suffer less casualties as we fought our way through the island hopping campaign. And the Seabees made the island hopping campaign possible. At the number 4 slot, I have the Essex class carriers. Again, this was the pinnacle of aircraft carrier technology during World War II, in my opinion. And it was also the largest class of aircraft carriers produced during World War II. So having the best of a capital ship and the most of it, I think makes it a war-winning weapon. It certainly wasn't the Essex class carriers that were holding the line in the Pacific during the first year or two of the war. But when they rolled out, we were really able to launch the offensive and sustain it. And by that point, Japanese carrier aviation had been mostly broken, but it was never able to recover because the Essex class were so superior. In addition to being able to build airfields on whatever island you wanted with your Seabees, the Essex class carriers basically gave you airfields wherever you needed them, and the capacity for about 100 aircraft that you could literally take to the coast of Japan and bomb their factories. Not only did they show exceptional service during the back half of World War II, but the Essex class carriers remained a mainstay of the U.S. fleet, with the last ones in service into the 90s, into my lifetime. So these ships showed great service. They were able to take a tremendous beating. They weren't particularly well armored, but they had great damage control capacity. And so you could blow through the flight deck of one and then cover it in plywood and keep conducting operations. And the Essex class carriers were really the both the cause of and the answer to kamikaze attacks. They were the cause of because without the ability to launch conventional air attacks, the Japanese had to resort to kamikazes. But they were the answer to it because they were able to put up combat air patrol to protect against kamikazes, and they were able to strike the kamikaze bases before the aircraft launched. In the number 3 slot, I have radar, and I think that's a little too generic. So I'm going to specifically say the SK air search radar. Radar was pretty widely developed and used by the U.S. Navy during World War II. By the end of the war, just about everyone was using it, but I'd say the United States and the United States Navy in particular was at the head of the pack in using it and deploying it. And I think it was the air search radars that were the most significant. For a battleship, you could spot the fall of shot for your main guns on the air search radars. The explosions were so heavy. So we see during a couple of late war engagements, even battleships that don't have surface search radars can still do accurate nighttime gunnery with air search sets. And World War II was an air war more so than a surface war. So I would say the air search sets were more important than the surface search sets, particularly as you get to the end of the war where the kamikaze is the main threat, being able to detect it early and vector aircraft to engage it prior to having to engage it with your own anti-aircraft guns. For that reason, I think that the SK radar was a really war-winning system. In the number 2 slot, I'm going to put the VT fuse. The veritably timed fuse, or the VT fuse, was a radical improvement, and it was first deployed on ships, but it would be used for land combat later. Basically, they figured out how to shrink a short-range radar into the size of a Coke bottle that was able to be shot out of a gun, so that, say, for example, the 5-inch guns of Battleship New Jersey could have these fuses in them. And instead of having to calculate or guesstimate the range to the target and the time it would take the shell to get there and manually set that fuse to make it detonate near the aircraft, you could just fire a VT fused shell, and the little onboard radar would send out pings, detect when it was close to an aircraft, and explode on its own without having to set anything else. And so the amount of aircraft that shipboard anti-aircraft guns were able to shoot down once the VT fuse was introduced goes up exponentially compared to what you're doing when you're setting the fuses yourselves. And it really makes shipboard AA come up to speed with aircraft's ability to destroy ships. The VT fuse was also used over land. Initially, it was such a high-tech and top-secret weapon. The U.S. military didn't even want their ships firing it when they were close to shore in case one didn't detonate and landed on the ground and could be recovered by the enemy. However, by the Battle of the Bulge, the U.S. needed a weapon to help turn the tide of the battle, and so they started putting VT fuses in land artillery shells. And that meant that the artillery the shell would be able to detect when it was getting close to the ground and explode above it, dropping shrapnel into the foxholes. And this ability to consistently do that was able to really do a number to the Wehrmacht. So both as a land weapon and as a ship-based weapon system, the VT fuse was really important. Because it's got an attachment to Battleship New Jersey in that we use that weapon, we'll probably cover that in more depth in a future video, so stay tuned for that. And finally, in my number 1 position, I have strategic bombing. This seems like a pretty nebulous concept, but it was something that was purely the United States and Great Britain. Other countries did tactical bombing in support of troops. But the U.S. and Great Britain were really the only countries that were strategically bombing, and they strategically bombed both Germany and the European axis and Japan. They were able to do a real hurt to civilian centers, the civilian population, and the industry around that. Strategic bombing on its own, I don't believe was a war-winning system. However, it was a significant benefit to the Allies that they were able to consistently strategically bomb their enemy's homeland throughout the war. And with the exception of the Battle of Britain, not suffered too much in response. In particular, late war strategic bombing techniques such as firebombing, which obliterated population centers in both Germany and Japan, and later the use of the atomic bombs, which were a major technological innovation in their own right, made strategic bombing a really devastating weapon. When you can just wipe a city off the map in a night and any of the industry based in that city is now gone, and the entire population of that city that survives has to be housed and fed by their government, really starts to turn the favor of the war in your favor. Really starts to turn the tide of the war in your favor. So you'll notice that there wasn't anything significantly battleship related on my list, even though it focused pretty heavily on the naval technology and the war in the Pacific. Battleships were great weapon systems, and they had some great innovations during World War II. We talk about that a lot on this channel. But they weren't war-winning weapon systems. Do you agree or disagree with that? Let us know in the comments section down below. Also, let me know your list? Would you have reorganized my list? Even now, rereading it, I don't entirely agree with what I wrote earlier in terms of their placement. Would you have put other technologies on there in place of ones that I had? And what would you say for other nations? Let us know in the comment section down below. I'm interested in seeing. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of private individuals and businesses. In particular, it's the support that individuals like yourselves have given us over the last year that allowed us to step up our game, making videos more frequently. So we really appreciate that. And if you'd like to continue to support us, there's a link in the description below. You can also support us by clicking the like, share, and subscribe buttons, telling everybody that we exist. This will also help you see when we're putting out new content several times a week. Thanks for watching.